In 1944, as Allied troops fought their way across the beaches of Normandy, 44 nations gathered at a quiet mountain resort in New Hampshire. They were there to build something far more enduring than any military victory: the architecture of the global economy for the next century. But the great paradox of that weekend in July was almost entirely invisible to the delegates sitting in the Mount Washington Hotel. The country proposing this new system, the United States, was also the only country positioned to extract maximum benefit from it. They voted on rules that would quietly transfer enormous financial hegemony to the nation already holding most of the world's wealth. They voted anyway. In doing so, they engineered the most successful financial empire in human history. One that required no colonies, no conquests, only paper, ink, and a carefully constructed set of rules. To understand the magnitude of this transfer, we have to look at the world just a decade earlier. For most of modern history, the United States was not the center of the financial universe. The British pound was the undisputed king, backed by the largest empire the globe had ever seen and a gold standard that felt as permanent as gravity. By 1920, London handled roughly 60% of all global trade financing. The City of London was the Wall Street of its era. Then came the Great Depression. And with it, a catastrophic unraveling. Britain abandoned gold in 1931. The U.S. followed in 1933. France held out until 1936. What emerged was not a new order, but a chaotic scramble. A decade of competitive currency devaluations, brutal trade wars, and suffocating capital controls. Ordinary people experienced it as poverty and the slow collapse of everything they knew. American policymakers drew a ruthless conclusion from this trauma. The next time the world needed a financial system, it could not be left to the free market. It had to be designed. And it had to be designed by the only nation with the sheer force to enforce it. The United States did not simply wait for the smoke to clear in 1945 to announce its dominance. It spent the entire war engineering this exact outcome, often in ways that were entirely opaque even to its closest allies. Consider the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. On the surface, it was an act of profound generosity, allowing Franklin Roosevelt to supply weapons to Britain and the Soviet Union without requiring immediate payment. Beneath the surface, it was a financial strategy of terrifying sophistication. Britain received roughly $31 billion in aid. But the real price was hidden in the fine print. The U.S. demanded that Britain liquidate its overseas investments, drain its dollar reserves, and dismantle the imperial preference system that had protected British exporters for generations. By 1945, Britain was the world's largest debtor nation. The United States held 70% of the world's monetary gold. The new financial order was not being negotiated from a position of equality. It was being built directly on the ruins of the old one. This brings us to the main event at Bretton Woods. The two dominant figures in the room could not have been more different. John Maynard Keynes, representing a bankrupt Britain, was a towering intellectual legend. He arrived with a brilliant proposal for a new international currency called the Bancor. It would be managed by a global central bank. No single nation would control it. Trade imbalances would be settled automatically, penalizing surplus countries just as heavily as deficit ones. It was elegant. It was theoretically flawless. And it was dead on arrival. Opposing him was Harry Dexter White, a relatively obscure American Treasury official. White's proposal was far simpler, and for the United States, infinitely more advantageous. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. But White harbored a secret that adds a layer of almost unbelievable irony to the birth of the American financial empire. Declassified Soviet cables later revealed that White was passing highly classified information to the USSR. The profound irony. While designing the IMF and World Bank voting quotas to cement American hegemony, White secretly embedded structural advantages that favored the Soviet Union, essentially helping architect the capitalist world's financial fortress with one hand while slipping the blueprints to the KGB with the other. The Soviets ultimately refused to ratify the agreement, but the structural dominance White built for the U.S. remained entirely intact. Keynes fought for the Bancor until the final hours, but he was negotiating against a country that held most of the world's gold and produced half of its manufactured goods. On July 22, 1944, the agreement was signed. The dollar became the sun around which every other currency orbited. But the architects in that New Hampshire hotel made one fatal assumption. They assumed the United States would run trade surpluses forever. They assumed dollars would flow outward only as fast as American goods flowed inward. They failed to anticipate the economic paradox that would eventually tear the system apart. Economists now call it the Triffin dilemma. To fuel global trade, the world needed a constant supply of dollars. But to supply those dollars, the U.S. had to run persistent trade deficits. And the more dollars it printed to supply the world, the less confident the world became that the U.S. actually had enough gold to back them. By the late 1950s, the math was breaking. Foreign central banks were accumulating dollars faster than American gold reserves could cover them. French President Charles de Gaulle saw the vulnerability and exploited it. In 1965, he literally sent the French Navy to New York Harbor to demand physical gold in exchange for their dollar reserves. It was a theatrical, humiliating gesture that exposed the fragility of the entire system. The U.S. was enjoying what French officials bitterly dubbed the exorbitant privilege, the ability to buy real, tangible goods from the rest of the world simply by printing pieces of paper. But the privilege was bleeding the U.S. gold reserves dry. Then came August 15, 1971. Richard Nixon went on television and announced a temporary suspension of dollar convertibility into gold. The temporary measure became permanent. The original Bretton Woods system was dead. By all logical metrics, the dollar should have collapsed. Instead, it became even more dominant. The reason why reveals the true, ruthless genius of the American financial state. In 1973, the world was rocked by the oil crisis. Oil prices quadrupled overnight. Every industrialized nation suddenly faced a desperate, existential need for dollars just to keep the lights on. Behind closed doors, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia struck a deal that would alter the course of history. In exchange for unconditional American military protection, Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exclusively in dollars and recycle its massive surplus revenues into U.S. Treasury bonds. The rest of OPEC quickly followed. The petrodollar system was born. It did not matter that the dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was now backed by something far more practical. The fact that every single country on Earth needed dollars to buy the energy that powered their civilization. It was a financial perpetual motion machine. Oil was the engine. The dollar was the fuel. And U.S. Treasury bonds were the exhaust pipe, recycling the energy directly back into the American government. This created a feedback loop of extraordinary, almost terrifying power. Countries needed dollars to buy oil. To get dollars, they had to sell goods to the U.S. or borrow in American capital markets. The dollars they earned were then recycled back into U.S. debt, funding American government spending at lower interest rates than any other nation on Earth could obtain. But this architecture also created a weapon. When the U.S. wanted to cripple an adversary, it no longer needed to fire a single missile. It simply threatened to cut off any foreign bank from the U.S. financial system if they did business with that target. When applied to Iran, the results were instantaneous. Overnight, Iran's oil exports plummeted, its currency collapsed, and its economy was suffocated. The U.S. had turned the global banking system into a financial panopticon, and the dollar was the warden. This is what geopolitical strategists now call weaponized interdependence. The very networks that make global trade efficient can be instantly transformed into instruments of statecraft. No empire in history had ever possessed a tool of such subtle, comprehensive, and bloodless power. The British needed gunboats and colonial administrators. The Americans only needed the Federal Reserve and the SWIFT payment network. Which brings us to the ultimate, unanswerable question of modern macroeconomics. At what point does the math finally break? The same incentives that created the dollar system are now generating immense pressure against it. The BRICS nations are actively building mechanisms to settle trade outside the dollar. China has constructed its own cross-border payment system, CIPS, as a direct alternative to SWIFT. Russia, entirely cut off from dollar markets following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, has accelerated its shift to yuan-denominated trade. Central banks are buying physical gold at a pace not seen in over 50 years. The share of global reserves held in dollars has quietly slipped from roughly 70% in the year 2000 to under 60% today. Headlines scream about the imminent death of the dollar. But this is where most analysts get the story completely wrong. The dollar's dominance is not primarily about military power, or even the sheer size of the American economy. It is about network effects. Trying to replace the dollar today is like trying to build a new internet from scratch. Yes, the current system has bugs, and the administrator is increasingly aggressive. But everyone is already on it. The value isn't just in the underlying code. It is in the fact that the entire global economy is already integrated into it. There are roughly $23 trillion in Treasury securities outstanding, traded in the deepest, most liquid market on Earth. There is simply no alternative asset that combines safety, liquidity, and scale in the exact same way. The euro cannot fill this role because the European Union is not a fiscal union. There is no unified European treasury bond. The yuan cannot fill it because China's strict capital controls make the currency incredibly difficult to move across borders freely. Gold is too volatile. Cryptocurrencies are too small. The dollar's position is not unassailable, but it is vastly more durable than the breathless headlines suggest. Still, history is a graveyard of financial hegemons. The British pound dominated for a century. The Dutch guilder before that. The Spanish real before that. Each transition was preceded by the exact same signals we are seeing today. Rising debt. Military overextension. The emergence of a rival power capturing a growing share of global trade. The United States now carries a national debt of over $34 trillion. A figure that would have seemed like science fiction to the delegates at Bretton Woods. But there is one final factor that may prove truly decisive. The dollar's power depends not just on economic fundamentals, but on trust. And trust is an incredibly fragile thing. In 2022, when the United States froze hundreds of billions of dollars in Russia's central bank reserves, it sent a shockwave through every capital on Earth. It demonstrated, unequivocally, that dollar assets were not as neutral as the world had assumed for 80 years. For any country that fears it might be next on the geopolitical blacklist, the incentive to diversify is no longer just theoretical. It is urgent. It is rational. Saudi Arabia is openly discussing oil sales in yuan. Brazil and Argentina are settling trade in local currencies. None of these individual moves dethrones the dollar. But together, they erode the network effects that sustain its absolute monopoly. The system does not need to collapse in a single, dramatic crisis. It can simply become less essential, one transaction at a time. The most likely future is not a sudden replacement, but a gradual fragmentation into regional currency blocks. The dollar will remain important, perhaps even primary, but it will no longer be the only game in town. The real legacy of Bretton Woods was never the dollar's dominance. It was the demonstration that the rules of global finance are not laws of nature. They are choices, negotiated by specific people, in specific rooms, at specific moments. And they can be renegotiated. The United States became a financial hegemon because it understood a fundamental truth of the modern era. Power flows not from territory, but from architecture. Whoever designs the system determines who benefits from it. The dollar's story is not over. But the next chapter is already being written in central bank vaults and digital payment networks that most people have never heard of. The only question is whether the architects of the next system will be as clear-eyed about their own interests as Harry Dexter White was about his. Because the world will not gather again to build a financial order that disadvantages its creators. The next Bretton Woods will be negotiated by nations who have spent 80 years learning exactly how the game is played.